overlooking the Boston Harbor from the clubhouse terrace. My mother whispered, "You're a failure as a homeowner," and the HOA Karen smirked. Then my black card hit the linen. They assumed I was playing pretend for status. But the clubhouse staff stood straight when the manager addressed me as Ms. Mercer. Tonight, I'm not just settling the bill. I'm settling years of being dismissed with the law, the truth, and a final move the entire neighborhood never saw coming. My name is Sloan Mercer. The glass doors of the harbor room hissed open, and the scent of old money mixed with salt air, lemon polish, and fresh-cut grass from the perfectly manicured lawns greeted me like an old enemy. At 32, I had learned to walk into rooms like this, not with the nervous shuffle of someone who'd racked up 27 violation notices, but with the quiet ownership of someone who actually belonged. The panoramic view of the harbor sprawled out, last rays of autumn sun setting the water on fire, while the lights of Harbor View Estates began to glitter like scattered diamonds. It was the kind of backdrop designed to make rule breakers feel small, to remind every resident of their place in the grand expensive scheme of HOA perfection. "Welcome back, Ms. Mercer." The manager, a man named Delaney whose face was a study in discreet professionalism, bowed his head slightly. "Your private room is ready, of course." His effortless use of my name sent a ripple through the small group behind me. My mother Elaine, who had been striding forward with the rigid posture of a woman perpetually braced for disappointment, froze. Her hand fluttered to the single strand of pearls at her throat. Her eyes, the same blue as mine but colder, scanned the opulent lobby before landing on me with that familiar language of judgment I'd spoken fluently since childhood. The HOA president Karen Hargrove, my mother's dear friend, and the self-appointed queen of Harbor View Estates, leaned in close, her breath smelling of stale coffee and righteous authority. "Don't overdo it, Sloan," she rasped in that conspiratorial whisper meant to cut me down before the evening even began. "You'll be crying when the bill comes, and when the next fine hits your mailbox for that mailbox flag that's still half an inch too wide." She thought she was being subtle, a quiet word of presidential caution. But it was a threat, a reminder of the 100 other times she'd implied I lived beyond my means and beyond the covenants. My half-sister Tara, younger by 5 years and infinitely more confident in her place in the approved beige color palette, was already framing a picture of the clubhouse's ornate floral arrangement with her phone. She lowered it and sidled up, her smile a beautiful condescending curve. "Wow, Sloan. Ambitious," she murmured, gaze sweeping over the damask wallpaper and crystal chandeliers. She tapped the leather-bound menu she'd snatched. "Don't worry, let me handle the wine. You probably wouldn't be familiar with this kind of list, especially after that last citation for unapproved plant species." Her tone was light, sisterly, but the message was crystal clear. You are out of your depth. Let the adults who actually follow the rules handle it. Tara's boyfriend, Nate, whose personality seemed to consist entirely of agreeing with Tara and wearing expensive ill-fitting blazers, glanced at the prices and pursed his lips. "They probably charge you extra just for breathing the air in here if your grass is 0.2 inches over regulation," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. It was his attempt at a joke, a way of aligning himself with Karen's pragmatism against my perceived recklessness. We were led through the main dining room where the low hum of conversation from the neighborhood's elite filled the air, deals being made, violations being debated, covenants being weaponized. I ignored the subtle turns of heads as we passed, focusing on the heavy oak door of our private room. Once inside, a sommelier appeared. Before Tara could open her mouth, I met his gaze. "We'll start with a bottle of the Ravenau Chablis Grand Cru Valmer," I said, voice even and calm. A flicker of surprise, then professional respect crossed his face. He gave a single sharp nod. The reaction from the table was far more satisfying. Tara's patronizing smile froze. Karen's fingers, those same fingers that had signed my last 3 $250 fines, tapped once on the tablecloth. My mother stiffened. This was not the narrative she had prepared for. The script she'd been reading from for the last decade featured me as the struggling homeowner, the misguided freelancer, the daughter who was a perpetual source of quiet maternal worry and endless HOA headaches. I turned to her, softening my voice. "It's your birthday, Mom. I wanted it to be special." She took a slow sip of water, eyes avoiding mine as she looked out at the darkening harbor. "Extravagance can't fix failure, Sloan." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Failure in her eyes was anything that deviated from the path of stable, predictable, and HOA-approved safety. Failure was not getting a corporate job. Failure was striking out on my own. Failure was daring to plant lavender instead of the mandated boxwood. Karen chuckled softly, a low guttural sound of affirmation. She leaned back in her chair, the picture of presidential contentment, and began to tap her thick fingers on the table. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to count every one of my violations. Each tap was a nail hammered into the coffin of my reputation. It was the same sound that had underscored every family dinner, every holiday, every tense phone call for the last 10 years. I took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of the room's expensive lilies filling my lungs. I looked at their faces. Elaine wrapped in anxiety and judgment, Karen smug and dismissive, Tara off balance and resentful, Nate just a confused echo, and I felt a profound, clarifying calm settle over me. Tonight is not about proving them wrong. The realization was as sharp and clear as the crystal glasses. It's about ending this. The game was over. The need for their approval, the desperate childish hope that they would one day see me, had finally withered and died. Tonight was simply the execution of a long-planned, meticulously crafted conclusion. Delaney returned and placed a small polished brass sign on the table just outside our door in elegant script. It read Mercer family. Not Hargrove. Not Hale Mercer. Just Mercer. I saw my mother's gaze fix on it and her expression darkened. To her, this was another act of defiance. I saw it as a statement of fact. I was the host. I was paying the bill. This was my table. The wine arrived. The sommelier performed the ritual with quiet reverence. The pale gold liquid swirled into the glasses. Tara watched my every move as I tasted it, expecting me to choke. When I simply nodded approval, frustration crossed her face. She changed tactics. "So," she began, tone dripping with feigned casualness. "How is that little freelance consulting thing of yours going? Still managing to hold on after all those violation fees?" The words were chosen with surgical precision. Thing, managing, hold on, each one designed to diminish, to patronize, to paint me as a desperate amateur clinging to a failing hobby while the HOA closed in. I picked up my water glass, the cool, heavy crystal a solid anchor. I met her gaze across the table. "It's enough," I said quietly but firm. "It's enough to pay for the things that are important." They all assumed I meant the wine, the dinner, the view. They assumed it was a boast. But as I said it, my eyes drifted to the far corner of the room to a heavy crimson velvet curtain drawn almost completely shut. It separated our private room from a smaller, even more secluded alcove. It looked like simple theatrical flair. But behind that curtain my first surprise was waiting, and it had nothing to do with dinner. Karen's finger kept tapping, tapping, tapping on the heavy oak table. A metronome counting down to a moment she couldn't foresee. But for me it was a trigger pulling me back through the blur of the last 24 months. The sound was the same, the smug rhythm of her certainty. It was 2 years ago in their sterile beige living room. I had just turned 30. I'd quit my marketing job 6 months prior to start my own venture, and the initial seed money was gone. By any conventional metric, I was struggling. "You know, Sloan," Karen had said, not looking up from the neighborhood newsletter on her tablet. "Without HOA compliance, you're just a glorified rule breaker. You plant what you want, You run around hoping for a tip from the board. It's not a lifestyle. It's a violation waiting to happen. She picked a piece of lint off her cashmere cardigan. I can still get you that entry-level spot on the compliance committee. At least it's stable. I remember the silence that followed. The only sound was the polite hum of the air conditioning. I looked to my mother, my automatic lifelong reflex. She was arranging coasters on the coffee table with obsessive precision. "She's right, dear," Elaine said, voice quiet as if delivering a sad, undeniable truth. "We just want you to be stable. You're a failure if you can't even accept basic HOA rules. All this dreaming, it's just putting off the inevitable failure." There it was. Not you are failing, but you are a failure. A permanent state of being. I was 30 years old. I had a degree, a decade of work experience, a fully formed adult life. I paid my own mortgage, my own taxes. I wasn't a child throwing a tantrum. I was an entrepreneur in a high-risk, high-stress development phase. But in that room, their words were a brand. They pressed it onto my skin, and the label failure, non-compliant, was stamped on my forehead for them to see every time they looked at me. That night, the label burned. I went back to my townhouse, a space so small I could touch my desk and my bed at the same time. The rain lashed against the single window. I sat in the dark for an hour, just letting the words sink in. Glorified rule breaker. Failure. Then I turned on my desk lamp. The glow illuminated a wall of whiteboards covered in flowcharts, potential client lists, and SWOT analyses. I opened my laptop. The spreadsheet was a nightmare of projections, burn rates, and pivot strategies. I was building Northlight Community Services, a B2B procurement platform designed to optimize supply chains and vendor contracts for mid-sized homeowners associations and private communities. It was difficult. It was abstract. And it was completely invisible to them. 2 weeks later at 3:17 a.m. On a Tuesday, the first contract came in. A small HOA in Cambridge needed a reliable vetted source for landscaping materials after their usual supplier folded. My platform found one in Germany in 20 minutes, vetted credentials in 2 hours, and secured a 6-month contract by 3 a.m. The commission was small, but it was proof of concept. I didn't call my mother. I learned to code basic queries myself. I learned to read covenants and bylaws. I learned how to negotiate with landscaping magnates in Hong Kong and chemical suppliers in Ohio. I learned the art of strategic silence. I learned how to write a 3-line email that could close a 6-figure deal. It was an education Karen's stable compliance committee could never have provided. But at family dinners I became a ghost. I bought my piece, but the cost was high. It was a cheap, flimsy piece that required my silence. My invisibility. "How's the website, Sloan?" Tara would ask, the verbal equivalent of patting me on the head. "It's going," I'd reply, moving peas around my plate. "Are you, making any real money, or is it still a hobby?" Karen would press, knife and fork held like weapons. "I'm covering my bills." "Humph." That was her only reply. A world of dismissal in a single sound. The one and only time I tried to explain, I just landed the Hawthorne Estates account, a multi-year contract to audit and streamline their entire vendor network. Tara just laughed, a bright tinkling laugh that cut straight through me. "Sloan, that doesn't even sound real. Streamlining vendor networks? It's just buzzwords." Karen looked at me with that familiar pained expression. "Please, Sloan, stop embarrassing yourself." I went home that night and wrote a single line in my journal. Stop asking them to believe. Force the truth to appear. That night, the goal changed. It was no longer about succeeding. It was about revealing. I started to build a room, not a physical room, but a fortress of data. I kept every invoice, every client email, every letter of commendation. I saved the wire transfer confirmations. I printed the press release from a trade journal that named Northlight Community Services most innovative procurement startup of the year. I flew to Chicago to accept the award, told my family I was at a webinar, and flew back the same day. The award went into the hidden room. I kept screenshots of my bank balances, the numbers growing with a steady, relentless accumulation of zeros. I built a war chest. I also built an arsenal. I didn't just study contract law. I devoured it. I learned about fiduciary duty, conflicts of interest, and LLC formation. I learned how to read payroll reports for patterns, for ghosts, for anomalies. I learned how to say no to bad clients, to scope creep, to my mother's invitations when I had a deadline, to Karen's demands that I just comply. Each no was a brick in the wall of my new self. Last week my mother texted me, "Birthday dinner at the Harbor Room. Your treat as you offered. Please, Sloan. No scenes. Just be normal." I looked at the text for a long time. No scenes. A scene in her world was any time I defended myself. A scene was any time I didn't swallow the casual insult. A scene was any time the truth threatened to disrupt her carefully curated HOA-approved life. I texted back a single emoji. But she was wrong. I wasn't planning a scene. I was planning a conclusion. Because behind my simple silent emoji was a chain of events she couldn't imagine. Behind my silence was a 10 a.m. appointment I'd had 2 months ago with Rita Kay, one of Boston's most feared forensic accountants. Behind my silence was a retainer paid to a top-tier law firm. And behind my silence was the independent audit I had commissioned, the one that had been quietly running for the last 6 weeks, its cover page bearing the name of a client, Hawthorne Estates, but its true purpose known only to me and Rita. The one that was at this very moment sitting in my briefcase, tucked behind the velvet curtain in the alcove. The flashback dissolved, leaving the sharp, bright present. Karen tapping. Tara scrolling through Instagram oblivious. My mother worrying about the wine price. They were all looking at the person they had created in their minds. Sloan the failure, the glorified rule breaker, the seller of dreams. I took a sip of the Chablis. It was crisp, mineral, and cold as steel. I looked at the three of them, the people who were supposed to be my family and the woman who had made it her mission to make my life a living covenant hell. And the question that had been hovering for 2 years finally landed heavy and cold in the pit of my stomach. If they ever saw me, the real me, would they even want to be in the same room tonight? The plan was a machine built of cold logic and quiet fury over 2 years. Every gear and lever was designed for this single evening. It had 3 core objectives listed in my locked journal, not as a wish list but as an operational sequence. Objective 1. Drag their prejudices into the light. Force the narrative they held about me, Sloan the failure, the perpetual violator, to collide with undeniable empirical fact. This had to happen here in public without warning. A shock to their system so profound it would permanently fracture their perception. Objective 2. Insulate my mother from the financial shrapnel. She was a passenger in Karen's car, oblivious that the president was driving them both toward a cliff. My actions had to shield her from the fallout. A preemptive rescue she wouldn't even know she needed until it was over. This was not about revenge on her. It was about saving her from the woman she trusted. Objective 3. Confront Karen Hargrove with the legal and professional consequences of her own arrogance and greed. Not with accusations or family drama, but with a meticulously documented case file presented in a forum where her bluster and condescension were meaningless. I would not be her judge and jury. I would simply be the courier delivering the summons. The execution of this plan began weeks ago with a single phone call. "Delaney," I'd said to the clubhouse manager, "I need the Harbor Room for a private dinner." The choice was deliberate. The Harbor Room was their smallest, most intimate private space, but its primary strategic value was its location directly adjacent to the main hostess stand and cashier terminal, separated only by a wall of etched glass that blurred movement but didn't entirely obscure it. They wouldn't be able to see the numbers on a screen, but they would see the performance, the posture of the staff, the prolonged pause, the eventual deference. My briefing with Delaney had been precise. This is a family dinner, my mother's birthday. It is critical that your staff behaves with their usual professionalism. Nothing more. He had looked at me, a question in his eyes.
Y clarifia, no fauning.
No special treatment beyond your normal high standards. When I arrive, greet me by name. When the check comes, process it normally. That's all. He was a professional. He understood that the most powerful statement is often the most understated one. He simply needed to treat me like any other VIP client, which to him I was. He didn't need to know he was a player in a one-act play. The centerpiece of Objective One was my American Express Centurion card, the legendary black card. It wasn't a prop. It was a tool. I knew their security protocols intimately. The concierge service I used to manage the complex logistics of my business had confirmed that the first charge at a new high-end establishment, especially one over a certain threshold, automatically triggers a brief mandatory verification call. The system would flag the transaction. The cashier would have to call a dedicated line. It was a security feature designed to protect their clients. But tonight it would serve as a 60-second crucible, a minute of pure agonizing silence during which Karen's smug predictions and Tara's cynical disbelief would hang in the air, thickening like smoke. Across the street in the warm glow of a 24-hour cafe sat Rita K. At 65, Rita was less a lawyer and more a force of nature. She had short steel-gray hair, wore brutally minimalist suits, and could find a rounding error in the budget of the almighty. Her phone was on the table next to her espresso set to receive a single text from me. The text would read, Phase B. Upon receiving it, she would make a single phone call, setting in motion the mechanism of Objective 3. She was my ace in the hole, the legal firepower on standby. The foundation for this entire operation was my work, my little freelance thing, specifically my contract with the Hawthorne Estates HOA board. 6 months ago, their board had hired Northlight Community Services to conduct a full top-to-bottom audit of their supply chain and procurement vendors. They were hemorrhaging money and they couldn't figure out why. The authorization they signed gave me sweeping, unrestricted access to their financials, their contracts, and their vendor relationships. It was a key to a kingdom, and I had spent months turning it in every lock. Took me 4 weeks to find her. Karen Hargrove's name didn't appear anywhere directly. She was too clever for that. But in the tangled web of shell corporations and third-party suppliers, I found a node. A small, unassuming entity called Bayview Maintenance LLC. It had an exclusive no-bid contract to supply Harbor View Estates with all of their basic administrative and landscaping services. Everything from mulch to pressure washing. Their prices were inflated by an average of 38%. The sole proprietor of Bayview Maintenance LLC was a man named Martin Hargrove, Karen's younger brother. Further digging revealed a series of regular structured payments from Bayview's accounts to another LLC controlled by Karen herself, filed under the laughably generic heading of consulting fees. She was skimming, siphoning money from the very community whose covenants she enforced with iron-fisted glee, just to fund her golf club membership and her sense of superiority. I never told my mother not a word. To tell her would be to invite chaos. She would have confronted Karen not with facts but with emotion. Karen would have lied, manipulated her, turned it back on me. She would have tried to mediate to preserve the cheap piece of her HOA-approved life at the expense of the truth. Couldn't risk it. Protecting her meant keeping her in the dark. Felt like a betrayal, but it was a strategic necessity. Her intervention was the one variable I couldn't control. So I eliminated it from the equation. The results of the audit, the flowcharts showing the money trail, the copies of the inflated invoices, the LLC registration documents, were all sealed in a slim black leather portfolio. It was currently sitting in my briefcase, which I'd left with Delaney at the hostess stand. It was my closing argument. But strategy requires nuance. Amidst the cold machinery of the plan, I added one small human touch. I had pre-ordered my mother's birthday cake from her favorite bakery, Earl Grey and lavender. It was a flavor she adored, a small specific detail that proved I was still paying attention. She rarely acknowledged such things, but I knew she would notice. It was a message intended only for her. Even in this I see you. I felt my phone vibrate in my clutch. I glanced at the screen. A calendar alert. 7:30 p.m. Time to set the next gear in motion. I excused myself from the table under the pretense of finding the restroom. In the hushed marble-lined hallway, I typed a short text to Delaney. Proceed as normal. When the card verification is complete, please have Mr. Park stop by to say hello. Owen Park was the clubhouse's general manager. His brief professional appearance would be the final, irrefutable stamp of legitimacy. It would transform me from a suspicious anomaly into an honored guest in a single handshake. Before returning to the table, I swiped to my draft messages. One was still sitting there unsent. I had typed it out that afternoon in a moment of weakness. Mom, I'm not a failure. I never was. I wish you could have seen that. I stared at the words, the plea in them, the childish yearning for approval that I thought I had extinguished. It was a ghost, a remnant of a person I no longer was. Holding my thumb over the screen, I pressed down and deleted the entire draft. Tonight there would be no more pleading, no more explaining. Tonight I would let the truth speak for me. And I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the diamond in my watch that it would be heard. The first course arrived with the silent synchronized choreography of high-end service. 2 waiters placed the plates simultaneously. Oysters Rockefeller. 6 shells apiece nestled on beds of rock salt, their contents bubbling under a crust of herbed butter, garlic, and parmesan. The aroma was rich, decadent, and filled the small room. Tara, who had been meticulously documenting the wine bottle label, lowered her phone. She picked up the tiny fork, nudged the sizzling oyster, and then looked up at me, brow furrowed in practiced sisterly concern. Sloan, honestly, she said, voice just loud enough to carry the weight of her judgment. This is incredible, but at this price, what are you going to live on for the rest of the month?
Instant ramen.
Before I could form a response, Karen leaned forward, placing her thick hands flat on the table. She adopted her presidential advice tone, a sound that always set my teeth on edge. It was a paternalistic growl coated in a thin veneer of false concern. Now, Tara, be nice, she said, though her eyes were fixed on me. But she has a point. Sloan, don't go into debt trying to put on a show for us. There's no shame in admitting you're in over your head. I told you that compliance committee spot is still an option if you just swallow your pride. Swallow my pride, as if my ambition were nothing more than a childish refusal to accept her version of reality. Karen, please. My mother interjected, voice thin and ready. She wouldn't look at me. Instead, she rearranged her silverware, moving the fork a millimeter to the left. It's my birthday. She then turned her gaze on me, and the familiar disappointment washed over her features. But she's right, Sloan. Can't you just be less impulsive? This dinner is also much too impulsive. As if the last 2 years of 18-hour days of meticulous, agonizingly detailed planning were a spur-of-the-moment whim. As if this dinner, this very moment, wasn't the most calculated act of my entire life. I picked up my wine glass, the stem cool and steady between my fingers. I took a slow sip of the Chablis, letting the mineral coldness center me. I met my mother's gaze. Mom, I said, voice perfectly level, devoid of the anger they expected. It's your birthday. Tonight is my treat. Please just enjoy the oysters. We could have gone to Bertucci's. Nate mumbled loud enough to be heard. I like Bertucci's. I smiled, a small tight movement of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. The chef is preparing a special dessert. Mom, but I need to confirm something about the ingredients, my allergies. I pushed back my chair, the heavy wood scraping softly on the floor. Excuse me for a moment. I walked out of the room, not toward the restroom, but toward the heavy velvet curtain in the corner. I didn't pull it back. I stepped behind it into the small dark alcove. It was a space for waiters to stage their trays, empty and silent. From here I was invisible, but the etched glass wall that separated the room from the main corridor, combined with the room's own acoustics, created a perfect, unintentional listening post. Their voices, no longer tempered by my presence, became sharp and clear. She's completely lost it. Tara whispered, a new sharper edge to her voice. She'll be calling Mom for a bailout by Friday. Did you see the price of that wine? She won't be calling me. Karen's voice rumbled, a low, satisfied chuckle. I'm done. She's a 32-year-old child. There was a pause. I heard the clink of her fork against the plate. I'm telling you, she rented that black card online. You can get fakes, you know. Props for losers who want to post on Instagram. It's pathetic. A cold silence fell over me. It wasn't a hot flush of anger. It was an absolute zero, a perfect crystalline stillness. I felt the last lingering molecules of warmth, of hope, of any desire for their validation freeze solid and then sublimate into nothing. Then my mother spoke. Her voice was an exhale of pure weariness. She tries. Karen, you know she tries. I held my breath. It was the prelude, the small weak defense she always mounted right before the betrayal. But damn it! Her voice dropped, becoming thick with a frustration that was almost grief. You're right. I don't know what went wrong. She's still a failure. Failure. The word hit not with a bang but with the silent, numbing finality of a closing door. It was the period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I stood in the darkness, my back pressed against the cool plaster, and I did not tremble. My hand, when I looked at it in the sliver of light from the hallway, was perfectly steady. The plan was not just a plan anymore. It was a mercy. It was an extraction. It was the only way forward. I waited 1 full minute. I straightened my shoulders. I smoothed the fabric of my dress. I composed my face, pulling my lips into a polite, neutral smile, the kind that revealed nothing. Then I stepped out from behind the curtain, walking back into the bright, warm room, as if I had just come from a pleasant chat with the pastry chef. All sorted, I announced, voice light. I sat back down. They all flinched as if a ghost had re-entered the room. Karen had been in the middle of a gulp of wine. Tara's phone was angled over her plate, the flash on. The chef is sending out a small, unexpected course, a palate cleanser, his compliments. As if summoned by my words, Delaney appeared at the door. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my mother. Mrs. Hale, I do apologize, he said, voice smooth as silk. I noticed you had a small water spill here. My mother looked down. There was indeed a tiny thumbnail-sized bead of condensation she'd accidentally swiped from her glass. Before she could protest, before she could wave it away as nothing, Delaney and another waiter were at her side. With a series of practiced economical movements, they didn't just dab at it. They unfolded a fresh, crisp linen tablecloth, and in a move that involved one of them lifting her plates and glassware, while the other pulled the old cloth and replaced it with the new, they completely reset her place setting. Took less than 10 seconds. Elaine was mortified. Her face flushed a deep, blotchy red. Oh goodness, no, that really wasn't necessary. It was just water. She stammered, hands fluttering in that nervous way unused to service that was so attentive, so absolute. It's no trouble at all, madam, Delaney said with a small bow. And then he was gone. The act hung in the air, a testament to a level of care they couldn't comprehend. It made them all deeply uncomfortable. This was not the service you got with a fake credit card. Tara recovered first. Picking up her phone, she angled it, capturing me, her mother, and the corner of the wine bottle. Just for the gram, she said, forcing a high-pitched laugh. You know, fake it till you make it right, Sloan? I just smiled at her. Something like that. The silence stretched. The palate cleanser arrived, a tiny scoop of lemon thyme sorbet in a frozen glass. It was intensely cold, intensely clean. Tasted like clarity. As we set our spoons down, Karen put her napkin on the table. She was done pretending. The service, my calm, the wine I'd chosen, it had all combined to create a deep, unsettling dissonance in her mind. She couldn't reconcile the failure she knew with the MS. Mercer, the clubhouse, was serving. She had to force the issue. She had to break the illusion. She looked at me, eyes hard and flat. Sloan, I'm going to ask you one more time straight. Do you actually have the money for this? The question was a gauntlet thrown. Tara stopped breathing. Nate looked at his plate. My mother closed her eyes as if bracing for the inevitable, humiliating confession. I dabbed my lips with my own napkin. I folded it, deliberately placing it beside my plate. I met her stare, and for the first time I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I let her see the absolute frozen calm in my eyes. "Yes, Karen," I said, voice clear and carrying in the quiet room. "I have enough. Enough to pay for every single one of my choices." My answer hung in the air, a statement of fact that allowed for no further negotiation. Karen's mouth opened then closed. She had no response. She had expected a tearful breakdown, a plea, an excuse. She had not expected a simple, verifiable yes. The silence was total, a vacuum, and into that perfect, breathless vacuum stepped Delaney. He moved with a grace that was almost theatrical. Holding a small black leather folio, he placed it on the table, not in the center but directly in front of me. The thud of the leather on the linen was soft, but it sounded as loud as a gavel. The bill had arrived. The performance was about to begin. I opened my clutch. I didn't reach for a wallet because there was no wallet. There was only the card lying flat against the silk lining. I pulled it out. The matte black laser-etched titanium felt heavy, cool, and absolute in my hand. I didn't slide it into the leather folio. I placed it deliberately on the crisp white linen of the tablecloth next to the folio. The sound it made was almost imperceptible, yet it seemed to silence the room, a soft, definitive thwack of heavy metal meeting cushioned fabric. It was the sound of a full stop, for pairs of eyes stared at it. It was an artifact from a world they didn't belong to. Tara was the first to break the silence. She let out a short, sharp laugh that was brittle with disdain. "Oh my God, Sloan," she scoffed, already reaching for her phone, angling it for a picture. "That looks just like the fake ones all over TikTok. Did you get it from a prop house? That is so cringe." Delaney, ever the professional, stepped forward and picked up the folio, ignoring Tara's comment. He opened it, saw the card, and then looked at me. His expression was a mask of polite efficiency, but I caught the microsecond of appraisal. He then bowed his head slightly. "Ms. Mercer, I do apologize," he said, voice quiet but formal. "As this is your first time dining with us in this capacity, our system requires a brief verification call with American Express for this type of transaction. It's a simple formality for your protection. Will you be needing a moment?" "She's declining it," Karen stated, not as a question but as a judgment. She leaned back in her chair, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She looked at my mother. "See, Elaine, I told you all, hat no cattle." She was trying to put on a show, and the card didn't even work. She crossed her thick arms over her chest, the very picture of vindicated presidential wisdom. Pathetic. My mother sank her shoulders, caving in. The flush that had started when Delaney changed her tablecloth returned, but this time it was a deep, burning crimson of pure second-hand humiliation. She was staring at the table, unable to look at anyone. "Sloan, please," she whispered, a plea for me to end this charade. I looked at Delaney, ignoring my family completely. My voice was calm and even. "That's perfectly fine. Please follow your standard procedure. We'll be waiting." "Thank you, Ms. Mercer." He took the card and turned. Walking out of the private room, the heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing us inside, and the silence began. The 60 seconds that followed stretched into an eternity. It was a dense, heavy silence, pressurized by their expectation of my imminent collapse. I could hear every sound. I heard Nate, who was trying to be invisible, nervously scrape his dessert spoon against the porcelain of his empty sorbet dish. Scrape, clink. I heard the faint, muffled hum of the main dining room beyond the door. I heard the blood rushing in my own ears. Karen was gloating. She wasn't speaking, but her entire posture was a shout of, "I told you so." She picked up her wine glass and swirled the last of the Chablis, a smug, contemptuous curl on her lip. She was savoring this moment more than any part of the meal. She was watching me, waiting for the tears, for the excuses, for the inevitable unraveling. Tara was vibrating with a cruel, excited energy. She was texting furiously under the table, doubtless narrating my spectacular failure to her friends in real time. "OMG, Sloan's fake black card just got declined. I'm dying." My mother was a statue of shame. She was perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap I was sure her nails were digging into her palms. She was living her worst nightmare. A scene, a public display of her daughter's inadequacy, her failure. I did not look at them. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow, measured sip. I set it down, aligning the base with the edge of the placemat. I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle in my napkin. I was not afraid. I was not embarrassed. I was simply waiting for the next gear of the machine to engage. This was the crucible. This was the moment where their perception of me was held over the fire. 30 seconds. Karen cleared her throat, a low rumbling sound. Well, she began, I hope you have a backup, Sloan. A real one, or I suppose I'll have to. The door opened. Karen's smile widened. She was expecting Delaney returning with the card and a quiet apology that it had been declined. But it wasn't Delaney. It was a taller man, his suit a sharper cut of charcoal gray. He had a silver lapel pin and an air of absolute effortless authority. This was Owen Park, the general manager of the entire clubhouse, a man who only appeared for dignitaries and disasters. He did not look at Karen. He did not look at my mother. His eyes found me instantly, and a warm, genuine smile lit his face. "Ms. Mercer," he said, striding forward, hand extended. "What an honor to see you again. I was at the hostess stand when I saw your name on the reservation. I'm so glad I caught you." I stood, shaking his hand. "Mr. Park, thank you for having us. The service has been exceptional." "Of course," he said, voice resonating with professional warmth. He turned slightly, including the table in his gaze, but never breaking his focus from me. "I just have to tell you, the entire neighborhood is still buzzing about the Harbor View Community Summit last week. What your team did with the event planning and vendor coordination. Frankly, it was brilliant. We've been studying your logistics model. Absolutely seamless." The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum, a singularity. I watched Tara's hand, which had been mid-text, freeze over her phone. Her thumb hovered paralyzed. The screen's light reflecting in her wide, suddenly blank eyes showed a face that was processing a million inputs it could not compute. Summit. Brilliant. At that exact moment, Delaney slipped back into the room, silent as a shadow. He was holding my card, the black leather folio, and a silver tray with 4 flutes of champagne. He placed the card and the folio in front of me. "All verified, Ms. Mercer," Delaney said smoothly. "My apologies again for the delay. Mr. Park has insisted we offer you and your guests a glass of champagne with our compliments." Owen Park nodded. "The least we can do. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." "Thank you, Owen," I said, using his first name. He nodded, gave a final polite smile to the stunned, silent table, and then he and Delaney were gone, the door clicking shut once more. The 4 champagne flutes sat sparkling on the table. An accusation in glass. My mother's hand, the one that had been clenched in her lap, rose slowly to the table. She gripped her water glass. She didn't drink. She just held it, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the black card sitting next to my plate. Her expression wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was a deep, profound, and terrifying doubt. The world as she knew it had just tilted off its axis. Nate, the quiet one, the echo, was the first to move. His face was pale. He had surreptitiously slid his phone onto his lap under the cover of the tablecloth. He was typing. I saw his eyes widen, then widen further until they were almost comical. He had found it. He'd Googled Sloan Mercer and Harbor View Community Summit. He slowly, almost fearfully, angled the screen toward Tara. Tara looked down. Her face, which had been confused, now crumpled. The condescension, the pity, the smug certainty had all evaporated, leaving behind something raw and exposed. Only Karen was left. She was a bull, too slow, too arrogant to understand the matador's cape. She hadn't processed the difference, the name-dropping. She was still stuck on her original premise. She let out a short, dismissive huff. "A summit?" She spat the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. "So that's what you're calling it, parties. You're a party planner." all that staging and logistics, does that little hobby actually pay the bills, Sloan? Does it put food on the table? This was her last stand. The final desperate attempt to hold the line. I picked up my champagne flute. I didn't look at her. I looked at the bubbles rising. A tiny, chaotic, beautiful storm. Last week, Karen, I said, voice as cold and clear as the wine. My little hobby fed 3,000 residents and secured 28 different corporate sponsors, including the largest community management firm in this city. As if on cue, Owen Park briefly poked his head back in. Oh, and Ms. Mercer, yes, my apologies for interrupting again. I just confirmed with my team. If you do need that rehearsal space for the Q4 gala, we'd be happy to close the entire west wing of the clubhouse for your team. Just let my events coordinator know. Thank you, Owen. I'll have my assistant call her tomorrow. He smiled. Excellent. Good night. The door closed. My assistant. 2 more words, 2 more nails. The folio was in front of me. I opened it. The bill was, as expected, astronomical. I took a pen from my clutch, a simple heavy silver pen. I added a tip, a number that I knew would make Delaney's night. Then, at the bottom of the merchant copy, I signed my name, Sloan Mercer. It wasn't the shaky, uncertain script of the girl who used to beg for their approval. It was a signature and authorization, a final definitive statement. They weren't looking at the amount. They weren't looking at the champagne. They were all, even my mother, staring at my hand, staring at the way I signed my name, as if I had every right to. As if I were looking at a map of a place they had never been. A place they hadn't even known existed. A place where I was not a failure but a founder. A place where my name meant something. The champagne sat untouched. The bubbles died one by one in the silent room. I let the signed bill sit on the table for a moment longer. A small white flag of surrender they didn't yet understand. Then I reached for my clutch again, but this time I pulled out a different item. It was a slim black portfolio, the kind lawyers use for closing documents. It was unadorned, its leather surface matte and unassuming. I didn't open it immediately. I placed it on the table with the same deliberate weight as I had the card. Thud. Another full stop. Karen's eyes narrowed. The confusion from Owen Park's visit was now curdling into suspicion. The bravado was gone, replaced by a defensive animal stillness. She was a predator who suddenly sensed a larger, unseen predator in the shadows. I unzipped the portfolio. The contents were not a jumble of papers but a series of laminated tab documents arranged with the precision of a legal exhibit. I slid the first one out. It wasn't a spreadsheet or a complex report. It was a single page, a bank statement. I pushed it across the polished surface of the table until it stopped directly in front of Karen. What the hell is this? She grumbled, voice low and guttural. Read it, I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of triumph. It was the voice I used in boardrooms, the voice of a consultant presenting data. She squinted at the paper. At the top, in a simple sans serif font, was the name Bayview Maintenance, LLC. She scanned the columns of debits and credits, expression one of pure contemptuous dismissal. I don't know what this is. Some kind of garbage from your business. Look at the top right corner, I instructed. She glanced up. There was a small, almost pixelated logo next to the address, a stylized B and M intertwined. Now look at this, I said. I slid a second document from the portfolio. It was a Harbor View Estates purchase order, one of hundreds I had reviewed, and in the authorized vendor box was a small logo, a stylized B and M intertwined. It was a perfect match. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Annoyance, not yet fear. So it's a supplier. What's your point, Sloan? That you can print paper. My point, I said, voice remaining perfectly flat, is on the last page of the statement, the section on recurring wire transfers. She reluctantly flipped the page, her thick finger traced a line across the paper. She was looking at a series of identical payments made on the 15th of every month for the last 3 years. The recipient was not a person. It was another entity. Hargrove Strategic Consulting, LLC. That, I said, is your consulting company. It has an exclusive non-competitive contract with Harbor View Estates. And this, I tapped the name of the recipient, is your shell corporation registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. I slid a third document out, the Delaware LLC registration. Her name was listed as the sole agent. These are your consulting fees. Fees for which, according to a forensic audit of Bayview's records, there are no corresponding service contracts, no work orders, and no deliverables. It's just money. Money that inflates the price of everything from mulch to pressure washing for an entire homeowners association whose residents pay dues in good faith. The room was absolutely silent. My mother was staring at the papers, brow furrowed. She didn't understand the acronyms, the legal jargon, but she saw the logos. She saw Karen's name. And then she saw the stamp at the bottom of the LLC registration, a raised notarized seal. She understood that this was not a family argument. This was official. This was real. Karen's face had gone pale, a sickly gray color under the warm clubhouse lighting. The smugness was gone. The condescension was gone. All that remained was a raw, naked fury. She shoved the papers back across the table. You, she hissed, voice a venomous whisper, were spying on me. You were digging into my life, my private life. I didn't flinch. I looked her directly in the eye, and for the first time she was the one who looked away. No, Karen, I corrected her calmly. I wasn't tracking you. I was tracking the flow of capital. My client, the Harbor View Estates Board, hired me to find out why their operational costs were 18% above the industry average. I followed the money and it led me here. To you. The reason a bag of mulch costs the association $22 more than it should is because you're taking a cut. Money that inflates the price of basic services for people who just want to live in peace. You work with the board? The voice was a stammer, a gasp. It was Tara. She was staring at me, phone completely forgotten in her hand. The pieces were finally clicking into place in her mind. The summit, the GM, the black card. It wasn't a show. It was real. With 17 community associations, Tara, I replied, gaze not leaving Karen. Harbor View is just one of them, the largest one. I held Karen's terrified, hate-filled stare. Then with one hand I reached into my clutch and took out my phone. My thumb swiped across the screen. Opening my email, I tapped on a draft I had prepared that afternoon. The recipient was the chief legal officer and the entire ethics committee at the Harbor View Estates Board. The subject line read, Advisory Notice, Potential Conflict of Interest and Vendor Fraud. Attached was a single password-protected PDF. The password was Valmer, the name of the Chablis we'd been drinking. The email contained a brief clinical summary of my findings and a recommendation for immediate suspension of all payments to Bayview Maintenance LLC pending a full investigation. My thumb hovered over the send button. The complete third-party audit is finished, I said, voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. My final report containing all of this and much more is scheduled to be delivered to the board at 8 p.m. tomorrow morning. I pressed send. The small whoosh sound from my phone was the only noise in the room. Less than 30 seconds later, a phone started to ring. A loud, jarring, panicked vibration on the table. It was Karen's. She stared at it as if it were a snake. The caller ID was not a name but a title. Harbor View Estates Office of General Counsel. She didn't answer. The ringing seemed to go on forever. My mother, who had been frozen, finally turned. She looked from the ringing phone to the pale, sweating face of her friend to the cold legal documents on the table. She looked at me. Karen, she whispered the question, a fragile thread in the suffocating silence. Karen, what is this? She didn't answer. She couldn't. She swallowed a loud, convulsive gulp. The smug, superior smile that had been a permanent fixture on her face for 10 years had vanished. It didn't just fade, it fell away, leaving behind the slack, fearful face of a woman who had been caught. A woman who had just realized the game was over and she had lost. The phone finally stopped ringing. The silence it left behind was even louder. I calmly gathered the documents. I slid them one by one back into the black portfolio. I zipped it shut. I looked at the three of them, at Karen's terror, Tara's shock, and my mother's dawning horrified comprehension. This isn't a trial, I said, voice soft but clear as glass. I'm not your judge. I paused, letting the words sink in. This is a notification. The portfolio lay closed on the table, a black tombstone marking the death of a decade-long lie. The air in the room was thick, unbreathable. Karen was a statue carved from fear. Tara's face was a shattered mosaic of confusion and dawning horror. And my mother Elaine was looking at me. Her expression was one I had never seen before. Not disappointment, not anger, but a kind of desolate betrayal, as if I had personally set fire to her world. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a fragile, splintered thing. You did all of this tonight to humiliate me? The question wasn't for Karen. It wasn't for Tara. It was aimed directly at my heart. Her pain in that moment was real, but it was entirely misplaced. She saw the smoking ruin of her friend's reputation. And her first thought was how the ashes would look on her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply stated a fact. I did this so you would finally understand that I am no longer the person you can call a failure. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and undeniable. It was the word she had used in secret just an hour before. I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the knowledge that I had somehow heard her. But why did you hide it all? The question came from Tara. It was quiet, tentative. The usual sarcastic armor had been stripped away, leaving her sounding younger, almost like a child. The summit, the company, all of it. Why not just tell us? I turned my head slowly to look at my sister. Her phone was now face down on the table. Forgotten. Because, I said, voice soft but precise. Last year at Christmas you told me I was selling dreams. And 2 hours ago you told me to fake it till you make it. You never once stopped to ask what making it might actually look like. You just assumed it was a lie. Tara flinched, then looked down. She had no reply. There was no witty comeback for the simple, unvarnished truth. My mother shook her head, a small, desperate gesture. I just wanted you to be safe, Sloan, she whispered. It was her oldest, most worn-out shield. The justification for every criticism, every dismissal, every time she had clipped my wings to keep me in a cage she understood. A stable job, a quiet life. I just wanted you to be safe. Safety isn't a feeling, Mom, I replied, and my voice was harder, now honed to a sharp edge by years of her safety. It's a number. Safety is looking at the data. It's reading the fine print. It's understanding your assets and liabilities. Safety is not hiding from the world because you're afraid of it. What you wanted wasn't for me to be safe. You wanted me to be small. You're trying to destroy this community? Karen finally roared, slamming her fist on the table. The water glasses jumped. The sound was a shock in the quiet room. She was trying to reclaim control, to reframe herself as the victim and me as the homewrecker. It was her last, most predictable move. No, I said, voice cutting through her anger like a laser. I am protecting the members of this community who value the truth. The door to the room opened softly. It was Delaney. He didn't enter fully but stood in the doorway. His presence a quiet, professional interruption. He was not looking at the drama at the table. He was looking at a point on the wall just above my head. Ms. Mercer, he said, tone perfectly neutral. Mr. Park asked me to give you this. He said to let you know that if you require a witness for any reason, our legal counsel is at your disposal. He also sends his compliments on the champagne. He placed a single thick cream-colored business card on the edge of our table just inside the room. It was an act of profound, discreet allegiance. He then backed out and closed the door, leaving the card as a silent testament. My mother's eyes followed the card. Then her gaze dropped to her own hands. She was fiddling with the strand of pearls at her throat, the nervous habit she'd had my entire life. It was her shield, a way to cover the vulnerable pulse point of her neck when she felt threatened or afraid. But this time something was different. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp. The strand came undone. The pearls, small and white and perfect, didn't scatter. They just fell. A silent, heavy rope into her lap. And for the first time I could remember my mother Elaine sat in a moment of fear with her neck completely bare. Tara beside her slowly, deliberately picked up her linen napkin. She unfolded it, smoothed it, and then refolded it into a tight, perfect square. She placed it on the table. For anyone else, it would be a meaningless gesture. But for Tara, whose entire life was a performance of loud, sarcastic commentary, silence and precision were an admission of utter defeat. She had no more words. The script she knew had been shredded. The rage drained out of Karen, leaving a hollow, defeated husk. She slumped in her chair, a woman twice her age. I let the silence sit for another long moment. This was not a victory lap. This was an autopsy. "Mom," I said, and my voice was gentle. Now there was no more steel in it. "If you want tomorrow, we can meet with an independent financial advisor, a woman I know. She specializes in community assets and forensic accounting. She can help you understand your own financial position, your assets, your rights." It was an offer of a lifeboat. I wasn't just exposing the rot. I was offering her a way out of the sinking ship. Elaine finally lifted her head. She looked at me, and it was as if she were seeing me for the very first time. Not as the difficult daughter, not as the failed homeowner, not as the source of her constant anxiety. She was seeing a stranger, a capable, formidable woman who had just dismantled an entire HOA empire with quiet, brutal efficiency. Her lips parted. A small dry sound came out. "You don't need anyone's permission," she said, voice a marveling, desolate whisper. "To be strong." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an apology. It was a concession. A statement of fact from a woman who had just witnessed a paradigm shift. She couldn't deny it. It was the white flag of her lifelong worldview. I gave a single slow nod, my own declaration of independence, my own final closing statement on a lifetime of being made to feel small. "And I said, voice steady and clear in the quiet, ruined room, "don't need anyone's permission to stop suffering." The night didn't end with a crash, but with a long, hollow silence. I drove home from the harbor room, leaving them to find their own way out. I slept for exactly 4 hours, a deep, dreamless sleep, and woke before the dawn, my mind already running diagnostics. The emotional phase was over. The procedural phase had begun. At 8:10 a.m., my inbox pinged. The email was from the executive assistant to the president of the Harborview Estates Board. The subject line was stark: "Urgent special board meeting convened." 9 a.m. The high importance flag. A small red exclamation point glowed on the screen. My advisory notice sent at 9:34 last night had detonated exactly as planned. The body of the email was brief: "Ms. Mercer, your presence is required to present your findings to the full Ethics Committee and Executive Board. A car will be at your office at 1:30 p.m. Please bring all relevant documentation." My report, the one I'd told Karen was scheduled for this morning, had been a preliminary brief. Now they wanted the full autopsy, and they wanted it from me. At 9:20 across the city, in a high-rise on State Street, Rita K. was executing Phase B. I received a carbon-copied confirmation email. She had, as my legal representative and a private citizen, filed a formal advisory letter with the Harborview Estates Internal Ethics Committee. It was not an accusation. It was a proactive disclosure of potential conflict of interest submitted on behalf of a concerned third party who had reason to believe a member of their organization might have an undisclosed familial and financial relationship with a key vendor. Rita's letter was a masterpiece of legal understatement designed to give the board the ammunition they needed to act decisively while protecting me, their consultant, from any appearance of a personal vendetta. It was the second front in a pincer movement. At 10:15, my server at Northlight Community Services executed a scheduled data transfer. The complete unredacted audit trail, every invoice, every wire transfer, every cross-referenced LLC registration, every falsified consulting fee, was uploaded to the board's secure internal server. The file was designated Project Northlight Final Trace. It was a web of data, and at its center I had placed a single pulsing red node. It was a flowchart, a map of the money, and all roads led to Karen Hargrove. I had spent a year building that map. Took 12 minutes to upload. At 11:40 I picked up my personal phone. I didn't call my mother. I called a woman named Sarah Jenkins at New Harbor Wealth, the most respected all-female financial advisory firm in Boston. Sarah, Sloan Mercer here. I have that new client I mentioned. She's high priority. Needs a full asset review. Marital and personal. Yes, it's the sensitive kind. Can you see her today? For PM. Perfect. I booked the appointment under my mother's name. I paid the retainer with my own card. The lifeboat was now in the water waiting. I sent a single text to my mother. I've made an appointment for you at 4 p.m. New Harbor Wealth 800 Boylston Street. A car will pick you up at 3:30. Please just go. At 12:05 my work phone, the one sitting on my glass desk, began to vibrate. The caller ID flashed Karen Hargrove. It buzzed. A raw, angry, desperate sound. I watched it. I counted the rings. 1, 2, 3, 4. It went to voicemail. I stared at the screen, expression unchanged. The phone immediately began to ring again. Karen Hargrove. She was in a full-blown panic. She was realizing the email from the board's counsel wasn't a mistake. She was realizing her access to her own work email had been suspended. She was realizing the walls were closing in. I pressed the silence button on the side of the phone. The screen went dark. I would not be hearing her voice. At 1:50 p.m., I stepped out of the black town car and into the stone and glass lobby of the Harborview Estates Community Center. I was not dressed for a family dinner. I was wearing a steel gray Tom Ford suit. My hair pulled back in a severe tight bun. I carried a single slim aluminum briefcase. I was not Sloan the daughter. I was MS Mercer the consultant. The boardroom was on the second floor. The air was pressurized and still smelling of expensive coffee and palpable fear. 15 people sat around a U-shaped table of polished dark mahogany. The president, the treasurer, the general counsel, and the entire ethics committee. They all had tablets. They all had worried, expensive faces. MS Mercer. The general counsel, Priya Singh, said, voice sharp and without preamble, "Thank you for coming. We have all read your preliminary report. We have seen the data package your firm uploaded this morning. We are alarmed," I said. I walked to the head of the table, plugged my laptop into the projector, and the wall behind me lit up. It was my flowchart, the map of the money, and at its center the bright red pulsing node I had labeled Undisclosed Familial Relationship, K. Hargrove/Bayview LLC. My firm was hired to find inefficiencies. I began, voice clear and amplified by the room's microphones. We found a pattern of systemic fraud. I walked them through it. No emotion, no personal details, just numbers, dates, and Delaware registration codes. I showed them the 38% markup. I showed them the falsified invoices. I showed them the consulting fees that matched to the dollar, the purchase of a new boat, a club membership, a down payment on a condo in Florida. I had run her personal credit reports. Priya Singh, the general counsel, looked up from her tablet. Her eyes were like black ice. MS Mercer, a question for the record. Do you have any personal interest in this matter? Any relationship with MS Hargrove outside of this investigation? It was the critical question, the one that could undermine everything. My answer was ready. It was legally pristine. No, I said, voice unwavering. My firm has no financial interest or relationship with MS Hargrove whatsoever. She is not my client. She is not my vendor. She is simply the endpoint of a data trace I was hired to perform on your behalf. My only interest is in the integrity of your supply chain. It was the truth. My firm had no relationship. My personal feelings were irrelevant. I clicked to the next slide. And here is the solution. The screen changed to a new model. Northlight Community Services Platform has identified 3 pre-vetted, compliant, and cost-effective suppliers who can replace Bayview Maintenance LLC by the end of the quarter. Implementing this change based on our projections will result in an immediate cost reduction of 11.8% and a further 14.2% once the new contracts are fully scaled. I had not just brought them a fire. I had brought them the water, the new blueprints, and a check for the insurance money. At 2:37 p.m., the door to the boardroom opened. A security guard, a large man in a building uniform, stepped in, and behind him, shambling, was Karen. Her face was a ghastly puffy gray. She was wearing the same suit from last night, now hopelessly rumpled. Her scarf was loose, the knot pulled halfway down her chest. Her hair was sticking up. She was clutching her phone in one hand. "Priya," she blustered, voice cracking. "What is the meaning of this? My accounts are locked. This is slander. That girl," she pointed at me, "that girl is a liar. She's my neighbor's daughter. This is a personal dispute. She's unhinged." No one at the table looked at her. They all looked at me. I remained perfectly still, my hands clasped behind my back. Priya Singh didn't even turn her head. "Ms. Hargrove, you were summoned to this meeting to answer questions from the committee. You are not a member of this meeting. Please take a seat." She gestured to a single hardback chair against the far wall. Nowhere near the table. The security guard placed a firm hand on Karen's elbow and steered her sputtering into the seat. She was no longer a colleague. She was a person in custody. At 3:05 p.m., the president called for the vote. All in favor of the motion to suspend Ms. Hargrove effective immediately, pending a full external investigation. There was no sound, just the clicking of mice. As 15 executives checked a box on their screens, a small digital document appeared on the main projector. Resolution 11A, temporary suspension of Karen Hargrove. A series of green check marks appeared beside it. The president countersigned it digitally. It was done. At 3:22 p.m., Priya Singh made another motion. "Given the sensitive nature of these findings, I move that we escalate this matter. We turn over Ms. Mercer's full report and all of Ms. Hargrove's internal files to an independent external forensic auditing firm. I suggest Crow." The motion was seconded instantly. This was no longer a Harbor View problem. It was a legal problem, and they were putting it in a lead-line box and handing it to specialists. Karen, from her chair, made a small strangled sound. She understood what that meant. This was no longer about her presidency. This was about federal wire fraud. At 3:30 p.m., I was back in my own office. My aluminum briefcase was on the floor. I stood at my floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the city. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother. She answered on the first ring. "Sloan." Her voice was a wisp. "Mom," I said. "Are you okay?" There was a long pause. I heard her take a ragged, shuddering breath. "The car is here," she said. I'm going." "Good." "Sloan," she said, voice cracking. I know, Mom," I said. "Just go listen to what Sarah has to say." "Okay." Another long pause. Then she said the words that mattered more than anything that had happened in that boardroom. "I think," she whispered, "I am finally learning how to trust you more than I trust my fear." She hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, watching the sharp, clear afternoon sun glint off the Hancock Tower. Boston was laid out before me. A city of brick and steel bathed in a cold, unforgiving light. The machine was running. The work was done. That evening I returned to the harbor room. The sun was long gone and the harbor lights were sharp, cold pinpricks against the black water. The main dining room was alive with the clinking of silver and the low murmur of the neighborhood's elite. But I walked past it. I wasn't here for dinner. I was here to close a loop. Delaney met me at the hostess stand. He didn't ask if I had a reservation. He simply nodded. His expression one of quiet, professional understanding. "They are waiting for you in the study, Ms. Mercer." He led me not to the harbor room from the night before, that stage was now dark, but to a small private library off the main bar. It was paneled in dark wood, smelled of old leather and floor wax, and was dominated by a heavy partner's desk. My mother was sitting in one of the leather armchairs, not facing the door but staring at the cold, empty fireplace. She didn't look up when I entered. She was holding a single plain white business envelope. She'd clearly been to the meeting with Sarah Jenkins. "She gave me these," Elaine said, voice dry and unfamiliar. She tilted the envelope and a few folded bank statements slid onto the desk. They were from the joint savings account. Her name and Karen's. I saw what Sarah had circled for her in red ink. Not one large obvious theft but 100 small ones. A death by 1,000 cuts. Small regular withdrawals, 500 here, 1,000 there. Consulting expenses, reimbursements, all flowing to the same LLCs I had uncovered. A steady parasitic drain. I never looked. My mother whispered, gaze fixed on the papers. She told me she was managing our community savings, putting it into a high-yield fund. She shook her head, a small jerky movement. I didn't realize. I stood on the other side of the desk, hands resting on the cool wood. You didn't realize? I said, voice quiet but not unkind. Because she was dismantling your life in increments too small to measure. She was counting on you not to look. She was measuring her theft by how much she could dim your happiness a little bit each day without you noticing the darkness. She called it our retirement. She said the words sounding absurd and hollow in the quiet room. The door opened. I looked up expecting Delaney. But it was Tara. I almost didn't recognize her. The high-gloss curated version of my sister was gone. There was no bright lipstick, no sharp eyeliner, no carefully constructed waves in her hair. She wore jeans, a simple black sweater, and her face was pale, scrubbed clean. Her eyes were puffy, red-rimmed. It was the first time in our adult lives I had ever seen her without her armor. She stopped in the doorway, hands jammed into her pockets. She looked at our mother, then at me. Her gaze was uncertain, hesitant. The typical sarcastic tilt of her mouth was gone, replaced by a deep, trembling vulnerability. "Mom," she said, voice thick. Then she looked at me. "Sloan." She took a step into the room. I saw the call from the board's lawyers on Karen's iPad, the community account. She swallowed and her eyes welled up. They're using words like fraud and criminal referral. Is it true? Yes, I said. There was no point in lying.
Taras face crumpled.
She wasn't acting. This was real. Oh God. She leaned against the doorframe. "Sloan," she said, voice dropping to a whisper, eyes fixed on the floor. "Last night and at Christmas and for years."
I'm sorry.
She finally looked up, eyes pleading. "I'm so sorry." I piled on. I just went along. It was easier to be on her side. I held her gaze. I saw the desperate childish need for absolution, the desire for me to say, "It's okay, Tara. We're still sisters." But the words wouldn't come. Too much damage had been done. Too many years had been lost to her casual cruelty. I gave a single slow nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was an acknowledgement of her words, a boundary. I heard your apology. Now we are here. The past is a fact. Could not be erased by a single tearful confession. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the things we would never be able to say to each other. Delaney appeared in the doorway behind Tara. He was holding a silver tray with a single chilled bottle of champagne and 3 flutes. "Compliments of Mr. Park," he said smoothly, as if sensing the exact right moment to break the tension. He set the tray on the desk. "He has a particular fondness for guests who dare to face the truth." He looked at me, then at my mother, and gave a small, respectful bow before disappearing. The 3 of us stared at the bottle, a celebration. Felt grotesque. My mother's hand, which had been twisting the white envelope, stilled. She looked at the bank statements. She looked at Tara's ruined face. Then she looked at me, her gaze clear and sharp for the first time. The fog of fear and denial had finally burned away, leaving a core of hard, cold reality. "Sloan," she said, voice no longer a whisper but a quiet, firm statement. If I decide to end this friendship, what happens?" I didn't hesitate. This was the moment, the reason I had brought her here. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a business card. It was not my card. It was thick cream-colored cardstock with a name embossed in deep blue. Catherine Price ESQ. Senior Partner Price Denning Associates Family Law Forensic Division. I slid it across the desk. It stopped next to the bank statements. You are not alone, Mom, I said. You call her. I've already paid her retainer. She's waiting for you. As if summoned by the devil himself, my mother's phone sitting on the desk lit up and began to vibrate. The screen flashed Karen. We all stared at it. The angry buzzing sound was a violation in the quiet room. My mother's first instinct, her lifelong reflex, was to grab it to silence it to answer. Her hand twitched, but she didn't pick it up. She just watched it vibrate. The call stopped. A second later, a text message preview flashed on the screen. Elaine, pick up. Don't listen to her. Don't you dare make a scene. I will fix this. We can fix this. Don't make a scene. The same words she had used on me. The words that had been the bars of her cage for a decade. I watched her. Tara watched her. Elaine looked at the text message. She looked at the bank statements. She looked at the lawyer's card. Then with a steady hand she reached out, pressed the power button on the side of her phone, and the screen went black. She had never in 10 years not answered Karen's call. She had never hung up on her. She had never ever turned her phone off. It was a revolution in a single silent gesture. She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked at me. What happens tomorrow? She keeps saying she'll fix it. She can't fix this, I said. This isn't a neighborhood argument, Mom. This is a corporate and federal matter. I leaned forward. There will be a final meeting tomorrow, the one I told you about, the one with the board. But it's not to argue. It's not a negotiation. Then what is it? Tara whispered, voice raw. What are you going to do to her? I didn't answer immediately. My eyes traced the grain of the dark wood of the desk. My finger found a small hairline scratch near the edge. A tiny flaw in the perfect polish. It was shaped like a bolt of lightning. I followed its jagged, certain path. I looked up first at Tara, then at my mother. I'm not going to do anything, I said. The machine is already running. I paused, choosing my last words carefully. I am simply going to present the truth, all of it, in the proper public forum. The auditorium at the Harborview Community Center was not a boardroom. It was a coliseum built for community spectacle. Tiered rows of dark blue seating faced a brightly lit dais where the entire executive board and the ethics committee sat, their faces grim under the glare of the overhead lights. The projector screen behind them was as large as a billboard, illuminating the room with a cold white light. This was the public forum I had promised. This was the hearing. I saw the usual faces, the president, the treasurer, Priya Singh, the general counsel. But today they were joined by new ones, men and women in severe, expensive suits sitting in the front rows. I recognized them from the community newsletter, the major institutional investors and homeowners. The orchestra had arrived to watch the final act. I was at the podium. For the past hour I had been clinically, dispassionately walking them through the data. I had shown them the logistics, the inefficiencies, the path to the 11.8% savings. I had laid the groundwork. Now it was time for the final slide. I clicked the remote in my hand. The screen flickered and the new image resolved. It was a flowchart, a simple, brutal map. This, I said, voice amplified by the microphone clear and steady, is the beneficial ownership structure of Bayview Maintenance, LLC, your exclusive non-competitive vendor for Tier 1 maintenance and landscaping services for the past 10 years. The chart was stark. At the top, Bayview Maintenance, LLC, owned by Martin Hargrove. A thick black line showed payments moving to Hargrove Strategic Consulting, LLC, owned by Karen Hargrove. A final line showed transfers from that LLC into a joint account owned by Karen and several community funds. It was the entire architecture of her theft rendered in simple, undeniable boxes and arrows. Priya Singh nodded to a man in the front row. He was from Crow, the external auditors. Mr. Davies, she said, your independent team has verified this structure. Davies, a man who looked like he was made of concrete, leaned into his microphone. His voice was flat, emotionless, and carried the weight of absolute authority. We confirm, Ms. Mercer. The structure is precisely as Ms. Mercer has presented. We further confirm the original Bayview contract was awarded on a non-competitive sole source basis personally authorized by Ms. Hargrove, citing an urgent operational need for which we can find no documentary evidence. The contract has not been reviewed or rebid in a decade. Our preliminary damage estimate based on the documented and consistent 38% markup exceeds 8 figures over that term. A low strangled sound erupted from the guest seating area. Karen Hargrove, her face a mask of sweat and crimson, lurched to her feet. She was wearing the same rumpled suit from the boardroom, her scarf still hanging loose. "This is a lie. It's a conspiracy," she roared. The sensitive microphone at her guest station picked up her voice, amplifying not just the volume but the high whistling tremor of panic underneath. "She's my neighbor's daughter. She's vindictive. This is a personal attack. She's a failure. She's just a glorified party planner." She was pointing at me, her entire arm shaking. The investors stared aghast. The board looked, on their faces masks of pure cold fury at this breach of protocol. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Priya Singh. I waited for the echoes of her voice to die. Then I leaned into my own microphone. My voice, by contrast, was a blade of ice. "Ms. Hargrove is correct on one point," I said, the words cutting through the silence. "I am a logistics and event producer. Her assessment of my value, however, is irrelevant." I clicked the remote. The slide changed to the new procurement model. "I do not bring conspiracy. I bring verifiable data, and I bring an alternative. This alternative," I motioned to the screen, "represents a further 14.2% cost savings by streamlining your procurement through the Northlight Community Services platform. My data is in the report. Her accusations are in the air." Priya Singh's gaze was lethal. "Ms. Hargrove, you were warned that this was not a hearing for personal grievances. You can't," she sputtered. "You can't just, I built this community. You're taking the word of a child." The chairman of the ethics committee, an older man named Wilkinson, leaned forward. "Ms. Hargrove, your presence is no longer required. Security will assist you to the legal waiting room." "No, you can't do this to me. Security, please." The heavy oak doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. 2 uniformed security guards, the same impassive men from the day before, entered. They began the long walk down the center aisle. The only sound in the vast silent room was the rhythmic shush, shush, shush of their rubber-soled shoes on the thick carpet. It was the sound of a final, irrevocable judgment, the sound of a stamp being pressed onto a legal document. They reached her. They didn't grab her. They simply flanked her, one at each elbow. Karen's rage suddenly completely vanished. It evaporated, leaving a hollow, terrified old woman. Her shoulders slumped in defeat as they turned her to lead her out. Her head snapped up, her eyes darting across the room in a last desperate search for an ally. And then she saw them. Standing near the exit in the shadows just outside the main light was Elaine. My mother. She was not the woman from the restaurant. She wore a simple sleeveless black dress. There were no pearls, no jewelry. Her hands were clasped in front of her, not wringing in fear but perfectly still. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry and clear. She was not afraid. She was a witness. Beside her, with a hand gripping her arm, was Tara. Her face was scrubbed clean. Her expression a mirror of my mother's, still resolved and finished. My phone, resting on the podium, gave a single silent vibration. I glanced down. A notification from American Express. A transaction at Harborview Estates for advisory services has pushed your account into the highest annual rewards tier. Congratulations, Ms. Mercer. I smiled. A small private gesture. I reached into my suit pocket and my fingers closed around the familiar cool, heavy titanium of the Centurion card. I pulled it out, holding it loosely between my thumb and forefinger. Karen saw the movement. As the guards pulled her into the aisle, her head twisted, her gaze locked with mine across the expanse of the room. She saw me standing at the podium in my power. She saw the black card in my hand catching a single sharp glint of the auditorium light. And in that one devastating final second, she understood. She saw the card. She saw my mother and sister standing in the back, not weeping for her but watching me. She finally truly understood. I was not the failure at the kids' table. I was the one who owned the table, the one who had built the room, and the one who had just signed the order for her removal. I turned away from her gaze. I picked up a single crisp white envelope from my briefcase. It was the pro bono counseling and asset protection contract from Catherine Price engaging her services for my mother. I walked to the board secretary's table and placed it down. For the minutes, I said quietly. It was a legal notification. Elaine was no longer a dependent. She was an independent party with her own fierce representation. I returned to the podium. The doors at the back of the auditorium closed. The heavy click of the latch was the loudest sound in the room. Karen Hargrove was gone. Priya Singh looked at the board. We have the committee's recommendation. We have the independent audit. We have Ms. Hargrove's testimony. The ethics chairman Wilkinson nodded. We will now vote on the motion for immediate indefinite suspension pending the results of the full external and criminal investigation. He lifted a small wooden gavel. All in favor. He didn't need to ask for the nays. The large electronic voting board lit up. A sea of green, a wall of aye. The word motion passed flashed in bright stark red. Suspension. Full investigation. Wilkinson brought the gavel down. Crack. The sound was sharp, definitive, and final. It was not the sound of vengeance. It was the sound of a conclusion. The sound of a bill long overdue finally being paid. It was the sound of a heavy iron door rusted with years of lies slamming shut forever. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm so curious, where in the world are you listening from? Let me know in the comments so we can connect. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Sloan's journey. Please don't forget to subscribe and like this video. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that hype button so more people can hear it.